Tonight, the inside story from one of those men, General David Petraeus, former CIA director who ran U.S. Central Command and served as U.S. commander of forces in Afghanistan. I spoke to the general who oversaw the successful surge in Iraq and the surge in Afghanistan about President Trump's decision to walk away.
Well, look, a number of us, as was noted, have expressed reservations. I know that there are reservations elsewhere in the Department of Defense and in uniform. The Taliban certainly hadn't slowed down the violence whatsoever. There are very grave reservations, I think, that a lot of us have about whether they could even do what they've said they would do, which is to keep al-Qaeda and now the Islamic State from establishing a sanctuary in Afghanistan again, as they had a sanctuary when the Taliban ran the country when the attacks for 9/11 were planned in an Afghanistan sanctuary.
So there was a plan. The president wants to get out of Afghanistan. He's made that clear. He has also said that he wants to spend a lot less money on the effort in Afghanistan. And it looks like to achieve that goal, the plan that was undertaken was to try to make the Taliban somewhat of an ally in fending off these 20 different terrorist groups that are active in the region. And there was some determination that they were on board with that. However, they consider the current Afghan government to be completely to have absolutely no credibility with them. So, it's hard to figure out how this was all going to work. It seems like a real stretch.
Well, again, there were a lot of reasons for caution. Keep in mind, they refused to reduce the level of violence, even as we were negotiating with them in good faith. They have refused to actually negotiate with the actual democratically elected government of President Ashraf Ghani, with elections coming up, which they also did not want to see. So real questions about whether they would honor the Constitution and all the other elements that have been established over the last 18 or so years.
What do you make about, the difference of opinion? And there's always differences of opinions on these things within administrations, but it seems as though the Secretary of State was sort of more on the side of carrying out what the president said he wanted to achieve, and that John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, was very much against this plan and seems to agree with you and the others who I mentioned in the introduction.
Well, again, I don't know what took place in these final meetings where the president decided against having this particular meeting with the Taliban and apparently with President Ashraf Ghani.
Would you ever recommend a Camp David meeting, by the way?
Look, I think the symbolism of that would have been a bit troubling. Let's remember that that was where the decision was made to invade Taliban in the wake of the 9/11 attack. So I think as you reflect on that, certainly, again, I think the president very much made the right call.
So, in terms of the expenditure, the cost, right? Because there are a lot of people in the United States, and you addressed this in an editorial recently, who feel that all of these years later, after 9/11, 18 years of fighting this fight, trillions of dollars that have been spent on it, that enough is enough, that we need to move our focus elsewhere, that perhaps the places that we need to be concerned about are in Africa and other parts of the globe, even more so.
Asia, with China.
And Asia, and exactly. What do you say to them?
Well, I say those are understandable desires and reasons. We had those when we left Iraq, and Iraq was a much more stable situation at that time, sadly undone by the very prime minister who had helped during the surge to reduce the violence by some 85 or 90%. But that was questionable. This would be, I think, indefensible, again, unless there are some real ironclad verification measures in the agreement.
How many troops do you believe? 8,600 is a number that has been discussed. So if you wanted to lower the profile but still have the kind of presence that you think would be effective there, what is that number in your mind?
We're mostly in an advise and assist, a train and equip role. Again, even if you keep what we currently have, which is less than 15,000, that's a very small number. And the overall cost of this
you would leave them there
is 3% or so.
You would leave them that number or something in that neighborhood there indefinitely.
Well, again, the mission still matters. Yes. Again, we went for a reason and we have stayed for a reason. It's to ensure that al-Qaeda and now the Islamic State, which has moved in as well to try to exploit the situation, cannot reestablish a sanctuary. We've kept tens of thousands of troops on Korean soil. Yes, they're not being shot at and there are not casualties. And
General Mattis pointed that out when he was here just the other day.
There are many more than tens of thousands. thousands in Europe that have been there since the end of World War II. They're there because we have valid missions, and those missions are continuing. What I have argued for is what's termed a sustained commitment. This would be one in which the expenditure in blood and treasure is something, however tragic every loss certainly is, but is sufficiently reduced that it's something that we can sustain for a good period of time. I've also noted that the fight against Islamist extremists is a generational struggle, not the fight of a few decades or a few years. And you have to therefore have the sustainability of a mission. You have to have the determination. By the way, I can assure you that the forces that we're facing there, the Taliban and many of the others, certainly aren't going to back down if they think there is an end date for the United States contribution.
So would you say, based on what the president said today, that it's your understanding that he has changed his mind about this? You know, that now he sees things more the way that perhaps John Bolton sees it and you see it and General Jack Keane sees it?
Well, very hard to say, but let's remember a couple of years ago when he put out his first statement on policy on Afghanistan, it was conditions-based.
Would you say that there was a rush to a deal, that he wanted a moment? It seems like the Taliban sort of figured out that he wanted to have a moment, like the ones we've seen at Camp David in the past, and they didn't want to sign up for that at all. And you know, do you think that motivation is justified?
Well, look, again, there is an understandable desire to reduce our forces. Yeah. And again, I very much appreciate that. The question is, how far can you reduce without really putting vulnerabilities into this situation from which there would be a very difficult recovery? Again, what happened in Iraq when we left? The country went back to Sunni Shia violence. ISIS was able to reestablish itself, go into Syria, come back in, and we ended up putting many more troops back in there than otherwise would have been the case.
We ended up with an ISIS caliphate. Do you think this, you said in your piece, you think this would be even worse? Leaving Afghanistan would have a worse outcome than what we saw with the growth of ISIS? Look,
as I mentioned earlier, Iraq was much more stable. Again, the violence was down, and it continued to go down in the 3 years after the end of the surge. So that was very arguable. This, I think, is much less so.
Before I let you go, if you said you don't speak directly to the president about this, but you've been in this circle of people. If you could say something directly to him today about this, what would you say?
Well, I guess, you know, and I say this slightly tongue-in-cheek, but, you know, be very, very careful of declaring victory, especially in the Middle East and Central Asia. I think I might also offer that there are no purely military solutions, to be sure, for the issues that we see in the Middle East and Central Asia. But there are also no purely diplomatic solutions. Ultimately, these always have to be dealt with through a comprehensive civil-military campaign. We have to do it in a way that is sustainable in terms of the cost of blood and treasure. And we do indeed have to do it recognizing that the overall context is one in which the rise of China and the importance of the Asia-Pacific is much greater, indeed, than it was even after the 9/11 attacks.
A lot on the table.
Yes.
A lot on the table. General Petraeus, thank you very much. Good to see you, sir.
Good to be with you, Martha. Thanks.